In my discussion with the Frazier family, the phrase big feelings came up a lot because their roller coaster ride was filled with big feelings. Most couples anticipate that adding to their family will be a great adventure, as did Seth and Chris, who are friends of mine. I was aware that they wanted another child, and I rejoiced with them when Chris learned she was pregnant. When prenatal testing showed that their growing little baby's development was affected by a chromosomal anomaly, they were understandably devastated. Who wouldn't be? Losing a wanted and hoped-for baby girl certainly stirred up many big feelings inside of them, made even more difficult for Chris and Seth as they watched their 4-year-old daughter grieve as well. Chris mentioned this. She said, "I'm not only grieving the child that I lost, but I'm grieving the relationship that my child still living lost too. Watching her struggle through her grief and feeling all her feelings was like this added component to my own grief." This was something Chris said that she had not prepared for. Of course, how does anyone prepare for such an experience? But Seth and Chris are planners. Even though there was uncharted territory ahead of them, they availed themselves of some resources that made this difficult journey somewhat less arduous. They invited their families, their friends, their bishop, and their church community, or ward, to join them. Chris emphatically called this the single best decision that we made, to be as public about it as we were. Chris and Seth drafted a letter to be shared with their congregation. In it, they shared details about their unborn baby's prognosis, how this might affect Chris's pregnancy, and what support they would need from family and friends. I felt honored to be among those with whom they openly shared this adventure. I care about them, and I wanted to support them. Because they allowed us to join them, I was able to see firsthand how a person can endure crushing hardship with grace and integrity. Chris said, "So many times people, when they have an experience like this, they just want to keep it close to the vest because it's super vulnerable. But it was seriously the best decision that we made throughout everything that we went through, to be as public about it as we were. It was hard, don't get me wrong, but it was easier because we had so many people to support us." I enjoyed hearing about the many ways people supported them during Chris's pregnancy, immediately after Emily was born, and even now, years later. Chris's desire to help others through similar experiences has led her to become a grief and bereavement doula, a guide and friend who walks beside others who are grieving the loss of a child. Seth's parents and older sister surely would have benefited from some of the many resources now available to grieving parents and siblings. They lost a very young daughter in 1985, a time when less was understood about grief's effect on mental health. Seth thought his mother had to swallow the grief and carry on, which was the expected way to deal with death and trauma. I understand that sentiment. I've watched my own mother suffer for decades over the loss of 2 of her siblings, a brother aged 3 and a sister only 4 months old. I remember talking to her about a childhood memory she had regarding her little brother Bruce, who passed away during what should have been a routine tonsillectomy in 1955. My mother was 13 years old at the time and was given the responsibility of getting Bruce dressed for the day. She recalls having a sinking dark feeling about Bruce getting his tonsils out, but she didn't tell her parents. Then when Bruce passed away, my mother blamed herself, believing she had received a premonition that Bruce was in danger. She swallowed that grief just to have it escape over and over again when something triggers her memory. Even decades later, those big feelings can sometimes erupt from her as if she were right back in 1955, still that 13-year-old little girl. That kind of trauma associated with grief is stored in a portion of the brain called the amygdala. I learned about this when a counselor suggested I try a type of therapy called EMDR, which stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing. This is something Chris brought up as having been helpful to both herself and her daughter. When I was researching how best to explain how EMDR works for people who have experienced trauma, I came across a well-written article called Calming Trauma: How Understanding the Brain Can Help on the Phoenix Society for Burn Survivors website. This is how it's explained. When a person experiences a traumatic event, adrenaline rushes through the body and the memory is imprinted into the amygdala, which is part of the limbic system. The amygdala holds the emotional significance of the event, including the intensity and impulse of emotion. Consequently, after trauma, the brain can easily be triggered by sensory input, reading normal circumstances as dangerous. The front part of our brain, known as the prefrontal cortex, is the rational part where consciousness lives. Processing and reasoning occurs, and we make meaning of language. When a trauma occurs, people enter into a fight, flight, or freeze state, which can result in the prefrontal cortex shutting down. The brain becomes somewhat disorganized and overwhelmed because of the trauma, while the body goes into a survival mode and shuts down the higher reasoning and language structures of the brain. The result of the metabolic shutdown is a profound imprinted stress response. EMDR uses bilateral stimulation to alternately engage both sides of the brain in action. This bilateral movement causes the traumatic memory that is looping in the emotional side of the brain to integrate with the cognitive part of the brain. The eye and brain movement increases the ability of the prefrontal cortex to get online or find rationality in the traumatic event. Like I said before, Chris advocates for EMDR therapy and has found it helpful for her daughter, who would sometimes draw disturbing pictures as she was far too young to vocalize her own big feelings. I want to mention here that although you will only hear Sydney for the first few minutes of our discussion, she stayed with us nearly the entire time. We stopped recording when Sydney needed some love from mom and dad and some time to catch her breath after some big feelings came to the surface. I was impressed to see this principle in action. Chris set up Sydney with a pen and some paper while we adults continued our discussion. It was apparent to me that this was not unusual in their family dynamic. Next, Seth and Chris discussed how they planned ahead for Sydney's transition into kindergarten, knowing she would be faced with new friends and experiences. Sydney and her parents met with her teacher, the school counselor, their family counselor, and the principal. By providence, Sydney would have a teacher who herself had lost a child and was prepared to help. Her teacher put together a therapy box that held a coloring book and other activities that Sydney could use to help her manage what she was feeling in her body whenever her big feelings would emerge. This group of caring individuals shows us something about what educators can do to help a grieving child. Something we as parents can do is talk to our children about the different realities that could be happening in another child's life. A child is never too young to begin to learn empathy. We can normalize the conversation for children that death and loss is a part of this life, and if done with sensitivity, appropriate to the age of the child, it needn't be a conversation that makes them feel fearful or anxious. Of course, these are all just hopefully helpful suggestions. Nothing completely prepares us for the loss of someone we love, whether she be just weeks past conception or he is over 100 years old. Each individual life is a miracle of creation, and there is no qualifier for an individual's worth. Parents and siblings who have lost preborn children through miscarriage, abortion, or stillbirth know this as well. Just because they have not been with us for long does not mean they were not wanted and loved. Every year, the organization through which Chris received her grief and bereavement doula training celebrates these little souls by handwriting their names on thousands of seed paper hearts that are released into the soil to sprout as wildflowers. What a beautiful and public way to honor them. What a contrast that is with some of Seth's experiences. Although he and Chris have been very open about this grief journey, I was aware that Seth has had fewer opportunities to speak publicly about it. I wanted to understand why we sometimes forget that men grieve too. His thoughts about this make up a significant portion of our discussion and is something I want to call particular attention to. Seth thinks it's somewhat ingrained in a man's natural blueprint to shield his family from his own feelings of grief. That can be interpreted by others, including those closest to him, that he has moved on from the pain. But Seth knows that is not likely the case. He said that at times what looks like a muted response is due to practical considerations that might fall on a man's shoulders. Seth said, The problem for me is that a lot of times I don't have time to deal with my grief. So when something does trigger, I acknowledge that I felt that, but I can't feel more than that because I've got to go into this next meeting, or I've got to go do this, or there's something else that needs to happen. So usually by about 10, 11 at night, that's when I get to feel the process. That's when I can do it. My responsibilities for the family have to be taken care of. I appreciate so much that Seth sees this trend and is trying to correct the perception that men do not grieve as deeply as women. He is reaching out to other men with compassion, trying to help them and their families to recognize these differences, talk to each other about it, and understand one another better. What a tragedy it would be for a family to break apart based on the perception that a husband or father doesn't care deeply enough. More than likely, those big feelings are crushing him in the most private, least accessible areas of his soul. Still, grief that alienates people from one another is grief that needs to be processed and healed. Seth told me what he thinks has particularly helped them is that he and Chris have always been open about what they're feeling, how they're feeling, why they're feeling it, and their relationship has been built on communication. So now Seth is working through his private grief with a counselor. It is ironic that he was quick to provide this for his daughter long before he sought it for himself. But I appreciate his candor in sharing these thoughts. This is hard for many men to do. They do not like to share their feelings, and they do not like to be taken by surprise by what Chris referred to as sneaker waves. She put it this way, and it's so good, I'm going to quote her. You think of grief like the ocean, right? It kind of ebbs and flows. As you're watching the ocean, you can see the wave and you think, oh, that's going to be a big one. Sometimes grief is that way. Anticipating significant dates. Those are obvious. You can see them coming. But then there's those ones that just come up and grab you out of nowhere. Like when you're walking on the beach and there's that wave that comes and you're like, whoa, and you get wet up to your waist when you were only counting on getting wet up to your knees. I call those sneaker waves. They just come out of nowhere and they're totally unexpected. And you're like, wow, okay, we're feeling this now. I think that's well said. And it comes across to me as something manageable. Maybe we need to take a breath, an hour or a day to recover from such an unexpected reaction. But we need to take caution that what starts as a sneaker wave does not become an undertow, pulling us away from family and friends, left to emotionally falter on our own. A skilled grief counselor or therapist can be very helpful in learning to recognize the difference. A symbol the Fraziers have adopted for their family is the butterfly. They have butterfly items all over their home and outside in their garden. When they see a butterfly, they are reminded of their precious Emily. I wanted to see if there could be a spiritual correlation there, and I was led to a page published by the Florida Museum of Natural History. I learned that a butterfly's life is completed in 4 stages. First, it is an egg, then what we know as a caterpillar. After the caterpillar has outgrown its skin numerous times, it forms a chrysalis around itself. It's explained this way. When the caterpillar has grown enough, it finds a protected spot, molts for the last time, and forms an encasement in which they metamorphose. The caterpillar releases digestive juices that break down most of its body into a tissue cell soup, from which it develops 4 wings, new legs, new eyes, etc. When the insect emerges, its metamorphosis is complete. The fully developed adult splits the case open, crawls out, and hangs upside down to facilitate stretching and drying its wings. Its wings are inflated by pumping fluid into the wing veins. At this stage, the wings are very soft and wet, and the butterfly must remain suspended while waiting up to 2 hours for its wings to dry. Once the wings are stretched and dried, the adult flies off to feed, find a mate, and begin the cycle again. That is a much more nuanced and lengthy process than I had understood before. I see a correlation here between grief and the butterfly's stages of development. A chrysalis is made of the same material as an exoskeleton, so that means it's pretty tough. And during that stage, the caterpillar becomes almost unrecognizable to its former state, literally becoming a tissue cell soup. It's no longer a caterpillar, but definitely not a butterfly. How sad would that be if its development stopped there, never to reach its potential? How is that much different than when we swallow our grief, allowing the big feelings to fester inside of us until we no longer recognize the attributes of hope, peace, community, and faith? What of those who, due to their own discomfort, avoid or neglect those who are grieving or attempt to hurry along a person's natural grief process? Ecclesiastes 3 states, "To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance." A PubMed abstract from the National Library of Medicine, with a title that's too long to repeat here, speaks to the chrysalis. It states, "The metamorphosis of a caterpillar into a butterfly is an awe-inspiring example of how extraordinary functions are made possible through specific chemistry in nature's complex systems. As human beings, we are the most complex of nature's systems, and I believe that difficult experiences of grief and loss have the potential to transform us from one state into something much more glorious. The metamorphosis is painful at times, but it is impossible to reach our full potential without choosing to embrace the process that can create something so beautiful." I like what Chris said. Grief and all of the feelings that go with it are very much a human experience, and learning to navigate that in a healthy and faith-promoting way is possible with the right help. Thank you again for listening. We'll continue this discussion next week. For now, please continue to believe that grieving well is possible. Collect for yourself spiritual drops of oil, and always practice extraordinary compassion toward yourself and others.